Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are diving headfirst into, well, a really fascinating corner of global finance. And it's one that's heavily exploited by financial criminals. The world of nested accounts.
Yeah, it's a critical topic because
Yeah.
these structures, they can basically hide illicit activity right in plain sight, within legitimate financial flows.
Exactly. So, to help us navigate all this complexity, we've been really digging into insights from FinCrime Intelligence, specifically their work on the definition and analysis of nested accounts.
Right.
And our mission here in this deep dive is basically to cut through the noise, get right to the core of what nested accounts actually are, understand the significant risks they bring into the global financial system, and explore how institutions and regulators are trying to fight back, all based on the intel from this source material.
Hmm.
So think of this as your fast track, basically, to grasping a really crucial piece of the financial security puzzle.
Okay, so starting with the basics then. What is a nested account according to the material we looked at?
Right, so essentially, FinCrime Intelligence defines it as uh, one account being used to conduct transactions or manage funds for another entity.
Okay.
It's an account linked through another account. And, the source is quite clear up front. These structures can be used for perfectly legitimate purposes.
That legitimacy bit is important context, definitely. But as the source points out almost immediately, these accounts are also, well, prime targets for exploitation, money laundering, various fraud schemes.
Exactly.
And that's where the profound risk really comes in.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, and it's all about how they typically operate, especially in correspondent banking. FinCrime Intelligence explains that this usually happens when, say, a foreign bank or a financial institution needs access to the global financial network.
Right.
Maybe they're smaller or newer, or perhaps they just don't meet the direct requirements to have a relationship with a big international bank themselves.
Okay, yeah. So instead of getting a direct account with, I don't know, major New York or London bank, they go through someone else. They rely on another bank, usually a local or regional one that does have that kind of correspondent relationship.
Precisely.
So the smaller institution essentially nests its transactions, its customers, within the correspondent account of that intermediary bank.
And here's a detail from the source that, wow, it really highlights the problem.
Yeah.
This nesting arrangement often exists without the knowledge of the actual correspondent bank.
Without their knowledge. Wow.
Yeah. The large international bank providing the service might be processing transactions for entities it has absolutely no direct relationship with, entities it isn't even aware of.
That lack of transparency,
Yeah.
that hidden layer, that is precisely why nested accounts get flagged as high risk. Especially from an AML, anti-money laundering, and sanctions compliance perspective,
Right.
it just breaks the chain of visibility
Yeah.
completely.
Okay, so let's really unpack those key risks that FinCrime Intelligence highlights. The most obvious one, flowing directly from what you just said, is just the sheer lack of transparency.
Absolutely. The bank providing the main correspondent service simply doesn't have clear sight. They don't know the ultimate beneficial owner or the specific activity of that nested client, the entity operating sort of hidden within their respondent bank's account.
And this invisibility, it makes regulatory arbitrage incredibly easy. That's another major risk they cite.
Hmm.
So, if the institution using the nested account is based somewhere with maybe weaker AML-CFT controls, countering the financing of terrorism,
Well,
they can effectively use this structure to route transactions through a stricter jurisdiction while basically bypassing their own potentially lax oversight.
that's a crucial point. It's like using a clean corridor, isn't it, to move dirty goods?
Yeah.
And this structure is also highly susceptible to sanctions evasion. The source really emphasizes this. Illicit actors can use these hidden relationships to get indirect access to the international financial system, circumventing sanctions that would otherwise, completely freeze them out.
Which naturally leads to the big one we always end up talking about in financial crime: money laundering and terrorist financing.
Of course.
This opaque structure is just, well, it's tailor-made for disguising where money comes from and where it's going globally.
And even if the main correspondent bank is completely unaware of what's happening, just being linked to these illicit flows carries immense reputational risk.
Huge risk.
Yeah, the source warns that if it's discovered that criminal funds were processed through their correspondent lines, even via one of these hidden nested arrangements, it can severely damage an institution's standing, their reputation.
It really is a cascade of problems, isn't it? All originating from that initial hidden layer. And FinCrime Intelligence notes that because of these heightened risks, regulators globally, particularly in places like the US and Europe, have put correspondent banking relationships under really intense scrutiny, specifically looking for signs of this kind of undisclosed nesting.
So, given all that scrutiny, what does the source say regulators are actually doing about it? They point towards guidance from bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and others. And there's a heavy emphasis on the need for enhanced due diligence, or EDD, whenever nested accounts are identified or even just suspected.
Yes, exactly. And the core of that guidance, according to FinCrime Intelligence, is really requiring correspondent banks to dig deeper. They need to understand the downstream relationships of the banks they hold accounts for. Who else is really using that account?
And they have to assess the AML-CFT controls of their respondent banks themselves. Like, do they have robust systems? Are they monitoring and reporting properly on the nested activity they're facilitating?
Maintaining clear visibility. Comprehensive audit trails for all transactions flowing through that account.
Yeah.
It's absolutely essential, including, crucially, those done on behalf of nested clients. That's what the guidance mandates.
And it's not just a one-time check, is it?
No, absolutely not. Ongoing monitoring, periodic risk reviews of the whole correspondent relationship. The source says these are critical.
Right. And the source is also clear. If the risk tied to a nested relationship is just too high, or it can't be adequately managed or mitigated,
Then what?
regulators expect institutions to just exit those relationships, cut ties,
Makes sense.
and finding hidden or undisclosed nested accounts. That's a direct path to regulatory enforcement actions. And, of course, the requirement to file suspicious activity reports, SARS, to flag that potentially illicit activity.
So, okay, beyond just the regulatory stick, the penalties, what practical steps does FinCrime Intelligence recommend institutions take? Best practices to proactively manage this specific risk.
Well, they outline several pretty concrete actions. First off, during the initial onboarding process for a correspondent bank client.
Right at the start.
Exactly. You need to incorporate very specific questions. Questions designed to actually uncover any potential downstream or nested clients. Make it part of the standard procedure right from day one.
And maybe make it legally binding.
Yes. The source suggests including a contractual obligation right in the correspondent banking agreement. It requires the respondent bank to explicitly disclose any nested activity using that account. No ambiguity.
Okay. What about tech?
Leverage technology, definitely. Implement transaction monitoring rules specifically tuned to look for patterns or typologies that might indicate nested activity.
Like what kind of patterns?
Things like high volumes of low-value transactions coming from apparently unrelated third parties, or maybe flows involving high-risk geographic areas.
Geography.
Yeah.
That leads to another point, right? Conduct regular geographic risk reviews.
Exactly. Does the pattern of transactions flowing through an account suggest nested activity? Is it potentially originating from or connected to jurisdictions known for high financial crime or sanctions risk? You have to ask those questions.
Okay.
And finally, collaboration is key. The source really highlights the value of participating in industry initiatives, or utilities that promote transparency and information sharing across these complex global correspondent networks. Trying to solve this completely on your own, in isolation, is just incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. And where nested accounts are permitted, presumably because they've passed rigorous EDD and the risks seem manageable.
Right, under strict conditions.
FinCrime Intelligence advises meticulously documenting the rationale. Why is this relationship okay? And maintaining robust records of the ongoing monitoring procedures you're applying. Keep that paper trail solid.
It really just boils down to peeling back the layers, doesn't it? Bringing visibility to what is often deliberately kept hidden.
Exactly. It's all about visibility.
So maybe let's pull together the key insights from this FinCrime Intelligence deep dive.
Yeah.
We've defined nested accounts layers within layers, basically,
Right.
particularly problematic in correspondent banking.
Right.
We saw how they function, often, crucially, without the host bank even knowing, creating these significant risks, a complete lack of transparency, enabling regulatory arbitrage and sanctions evasion.
Facilitating money laundering?
Yes, and exposing institutions to major reputational damage, big consequences.
And then we explored the essential countermeasures. The regulatory push for enhanced due diligence, driven by bodies like FATF, demanding institutions understand the downstream risk, assess their respondent banks' controls, maintain those audit trails.
Yep. And the practical best practices for institutions themselves.
Yeah.
From rigorous onboarding questions and contractual requirements, sophisticated transaction monitoring, and vital industry collaboration.
It truly illustrates just how sophisticated illicit finance can be
Hmm.
and how it exploits complexity, exploits opacity within the global system.
Yeah, it really does.
What's fascinating here, thinking about the source material, even with all the regulations and the technology discussed, achieving true, like, end-to-end transparency across these complex, multi-layered global financial networks, it remains an ongoing and pretty significant challenge.
It absolutely does. And this FinCrime intelligence analysis, I think, powerfully underscores that rigorous due diligence.
Hmm.
It isn't just regulatory box ticking, it is the absolute bedrock. It's the critical defense line for protecting the integrity of the entire financial system from these hidden, pervasive risks, like nested accounts. That's a thought that really sticks with you, actually.
It certainly does, a crucial defense line. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material today.